Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Coleman McGaw, and I'm a member of the Young Adult Programs and Services team at the New York Public Library. I'm delighted to introduce today's Banned Book Club event, which is part of NYPL's Freedom to Read campaign. Thank you to everyone joining us today. At the New York Public Library, we believe in the freedom to read. We started this banned book club in response to the alarming rise in book bans and challenges across the country. The American Library Association recently reported that in 2023, the US saw the highest number of book challenges since they started keeping records more than 20 years ago. The majority of these banned or challenged books are for young people, and many feature LGBTQ characters as well as characters of color. As the largest public library system in the country, the New York Public Library stands united with the American Library Association and libraries across the country against book bans. Through the Banned Book Club and our Freedom to Read campaign, we are elevating and amplifying the important stories, voices, and titles that censorship attempts to repress. Thanks to this campaign, NYPL cardholders can check out a digital copy of Run Book 1 without wait times through the end of February. So if you've not read it yet, you still have another week to get a hold of it. If you haven't started it yet, we hope you will be inspired to do so by today's event with Andrew Aydin and Nate Powell. Andrew Aydin is a #1 New York Times bestselling author, a National Book Award winner, a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award honoree, a Prince Award winner, a Siebert Medal Award winner, a Walter Dean Myers Award winner, and a 3-time Eisner Award winner, and the recipient of multiple Coretta Scott King honors. Andrew is creator and co-author of the graphic memoir series March and Run, which chronicle the life of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Co-authored with Representative Lewis, March was the first comic work to ever win the National Book Award. Nate Powell is a National Book Award winning cartoonist who began self-publishing comics as an Arkansas teenager in 1992. His work includes the new graphic novel Fall Through and a comic adaptation of James Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, Save It for Later, as well as civil rights icon John Lewis's March trilogy and its follow-up Run. Powell's work has also received a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, multiple Eisner and Ignatz Awards, ALA and YALSA distinctions, the Comic-Con International Inkpot Award, and the CXC Transformative Work Award. We're delighted to have these folks in conversation today. We're going to start off the conversation with Nate. So just give us 1 minute to get situated. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, happy to be here.
And over to you, Praise.
Hi, Nate. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you. So, considering the complexity of the civil rights movement, what strategies did you use to capture John Lewis's essence and story in such a compelling way for the book? Also, if you could give an overview of the book Run for our audience who may not be familiar with it, that would be awesome.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Praise. Appreciate it. And those are excellent, like right out of the gate questions. Okay, so from the creative perspective, uh, I consider Run to be a natural continuation of the March trilogy. But we all know, trilogies work as a nice solid group of three. However, the tone, a lot of the tone within John Lewis's experiences and the way in which he sort of conveyed his experiences shifted. So, like, uh, I guess fundamentally, Run documents the beginnings of John Lewis's shift from direct action as a civil rights activist into public service, which ultimately led for him running for Atlanta City Council, running for US Congress, and holding that seat in Congress for decades until the end of his life. Um, but to sort of begin that transition, we can't escape the fact that the story of John Lewis's position within the civil rights movement and as a young person at the center of the civil rights movement also means, as many of us know, being involved in social movements and being involved in democracy in our world today is that, you have to grapple with people who, like oftentimes not everyone agrees about every fine point that's surrounding, what you're all working towards. And so the story of the civil rights movement is also a story of disagreement and conflict. It's a story of people within the movement working out sometimes pretty substantial differences, but ultimately finding a place in which to meet up together in the streets, in the courtroom, in City Hall, and working to actually shift society. So within Run Book One, it actually starts just 2 days after the end of March Book Three. And at the end of March Book Three, this covers, from the end of the Selma movement, the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, a key piece of legislation for human rights and civil rights, particularly for Black Americans who had been disenfranchised for centuries, but really the first major step in making concrete the promise of voting rights as representative democracy for Black Americans. But after this major achievement, just 2 days later, we kind of open the story by showing that John Lewis is back with, 12 or 13 local protesters in a small town in Georgia, just trying to attend a segregated church, getting arrested, following a lot of the same work, following methods which had been proven to agitate, to push, and to have results. But we sort of wanted to emphasize that despite these major achievements and this sense of momentum, that regular work has to be done. It's about showing up. And so just 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, uh, with the President of the United States heading back to a small town to get the work done. I guess another major focus within Run has to do with um, pushback within the movement. It has to do with even a younger generation sort of coming up within the movement and a split of ideas, the rise of Black Power. And John Lewis, as a young person, being, especially within Alabama and within Mississippi, being there kind of at ground zero for the seeds that were planted for the rise of the Black Power movement. Its original phrase being Black Power for Black people, being a call for representative democracy in Black majority counties in the Deep South. Um, and so we try to document fairly uh, and being as objective as possible, but also showing these splits in ideas about the role of Black Power and its relationship to organized nonviolence, to protest, and basically John Lewis finding himself kind of ousted from his own organization that he had been head of, and kind of having to start over by the end of Run Book One.
That's really amazing. You mentioned how after you created March, the Voting Rights Act was signed just 2 days after. So I was wondering, how did you reflect that in the story through your drawings and your creation?
Good question. Now, interestingly, okay, I did a lot of different duties on Run. I did a lot of lettering, um, and did a lot of work that helped bring the entire book up. However, most of the artwork in the book was done by another artist, Lauren Fury, who did just a knockout job. And I did a lot of illustrations, cover work, but the actual interior pages, those first 10 pages, those are the pages that I drew. So Andrew and I sort of had the idea to have that first chapter that was drawn just by me as sort of a bridge sequence that would carry us from the March trilogy into Run. And so the aesthetic of my drawing style was sort of the thing that would link March to Run and would allow us to like sort of hand off the torch to Fury as this new artist who really knocked it out of the park, but specifically was adapting her style to fit my style as well. And we sort of, as far as like having it resonate, that we're dropping into events just 2 days after the end of March Book 3, we sort of leave that for the reader to pick up on those context clues by indicating date and place and time. Sometimes it's a little more powerful and a little more meaningful when readers can make that kind of a connection themselves. But then, as John Lewis was reflecting upon his role in those early sequences in Run, we sort of had, from his perspective, he's underlining the fact that it's constantly centering yourself back into getting the work done, showing up with like-minded people, and the fact that that fundamental work in each town across America never stops. Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Hey, it's good. How are you?
Doing fine.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. Our next question is kind of targeted towards you because while I was reading, I just thought that there were so many important figures that contributed to John Lewis's story, from Julian Bond, who served multiple roles as a founding member of SNCC, which for the readers out there who don't know yet is abbreviation for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to Willie Vaughan, who played a major role in registering new voters. And so I just want to ask you if there were any other important figures that you wish you could have included or speak more on.
I mean, I think, there's always more that you can include. I think the 15 some odd pages of character biographies in the back sort of tell you that we tried to include as many of the people who made a contribution as we could. I think that's why we used this memo that we found in the SNCC archives from 1965 describing people's roles, and tried to give a mention to as many of the staffers who were serving and the roles that they served in, sort of both as a reintroduction to SNCC post Selma, but also to give as much shine as we could to these people who risked their lives and gave their youth in many ways to this effort. I think, there's so, in some ways, these characters that we sort of allude to at the beginning are folks that we had intended to flesh out and show more of their story. It was trying to, it's like you don't show a gun unless you intend to use it. Like that old story adage, right? Like we were mentioning a lot of these people deliberately because as you get into 67, 68, the early 70s, they were people who played even more of a role, and to show the development of both SNCC and the people who made up SNCC. I think when you talk about Julian Bond, though, it's so funny because, ultimately the story was intended to go to the 1986 primary campaign. And in many ways, had Run become a trilogy, it would have been about the relationship between John Lewis and Julian Bond. And I got to know Julian at the end of his life. I met him for the first time in 2014 at the LBJ Library's Summit on the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And it was a little surreal. I was in this room with John Lewis, but also Andy Young and Bill Clinton and Julian Bond and Andrew Young and Vernon Jordan and Mavis Staples, who used to call me her boyfriend. It was, and Julian spotted me from across the room, and he comes over. He's kind of got his finger up in the air, and he says, um, "You know, I did a comic book first, young man," because he had done a comic book in 1966 um, about his opposition to the Vietnam War, and I got so excited that he wanted to talk about that because I'd read it and researched it, and I was like, I know. Tell me about it. Who had the idea? Who was the author? Can I get a copy? Do you have a copy? You know, I'm like giving him all these questions, and I think he was a little taken aback, right? Like that you know you have this expectation that and I see this a lot, you know, in other parts of comics and publishing where, you know, there's an attitude of you do something that others have done before, but you act like you discovered it. And in fact, you know, we tried very hard never to be that. Whether it was with March and talking about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story, the Snick comics from 1966 that Jennifer Lawson and Cortland Cox made, but also this comic, Vietnam. And so Julian and I got to be friends. We would text, we would email, and it also became a vehicle for Julian and Congressman Lewis to relay messages, right? I think they weren't quite ready to be on that "I'm just going to call you up all the time" phase. Um, and I remember in February of 2015, on the Congressman's birthday, Julian called me and he said, you know, I picked up and he said, you know, just I'm going to call you back. I want you to let this go to voicemail. I was like, okay. And he called and he left this voicemail for the congressman wishing him a happy birthday. And he started off, he goes, "Mr. Chairman," because he still called John Lewis Mr. Chairman after all that time as chairman of SNCC. And I played that message for the congressman, and the congressman got, I think, tickled would be the best way to put it. And so your question really gets at too this point of you get to know these people, right? Like you're working with them, but you're also like interacting with them as human beings now, 50 years after the time period in which you're telling their story. And it then in that sense it becomes almost emotionally difficult not to include things about these people that you've gotten to know who are incredibly special, incredibly kind, who've helped you along the way. And so you work really hard to include as much about them, as much reference to them, and as much of their story as you can while keeping the focus on John Lewis's. Thank you. That was a fantastic question.
So I also have a question for Andrew. I was wondering, in the beginning of the story on page 12, a Black man was pulled over and the phrase, "Some people are just sick and tired of being sick and tired," was used. So I wanted to know, what does this phrase mean to you, and how does it demonstrate the impact the civil rights movement had on Black individuals?
You know, that phrase is a callback to something Fannie Lou Hamer used to say. And in fact was a reference to something we show in March Book 3. And when you think about it in the context of what Fannie Lou Hamer endured, right? Forced sterilization, being raped, being beaten, all of the things that she spoke about at the 1964 Democratic Convention, and putting that context, right? Like sometimes the art of making comics is not how much can you write, but how little can you write, and yet how much can you convey with as few words as possible. And I think, you know, that means in this particular instance that worked, as it sticks out to you like that, because there is so much history and meaning steeped in that phrase, um, that if I, you know, if the congressman and I had written all of that out, would have lost you probably as a reader. But you find those right words and you can convey a tremendous amount of emotion and history. And I think you know it also in many ways embodied the sense of righteous indignation that had overtaken the movement by that time. How many beatings, how many deaths, how many murders, how many arrests. And as if you see that in the context of why Run itself exists, which is that we had made March, it had these essential lessons, but it became clear to us in many ways what we are enduring now was on the horizon, right? The pushback, which I think has gotten far more extreme than we ever imagined, but certainly this direction was foreseen. You had to show not just the high watermark of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, but the pushback, the sense of we've done all of this, we got the bill passed, and now you're asking us to do more. And the emotional reaction of individuals at that time of exasperation, of frustration, the snap, the people just getting fed up, right? And I think we look at this and sense that type of emotion in the context of Rosa Parks, right? Where like she was tired, she had work, she wanted to sit down on the bus, right? That's at least the story we're told. I think it's much more important for all of us to understand the opposite side of that, right? The 1966, 1965 reaction of in a similar vein of I can't. I have to do something. I have to um, I can't just turn the other cheek. I can't just stay silent. I can't just grin and bear it. And trying to contextualize that for all of us, and now what we're going through of, I think we all felt like we'd endured and then we got over it, and now we're having to endure again. And it's very similar to that sense that many of the movement participants felt in 1965 and 1966 after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, after the Watts Uprising, and the reaction to the broader white public that we've seen of, you got this, now we're just going to push back and minimize it as much as possible.
Definitely. I think that was a really powerful scene that stood out to me. So I also wanted to ask Nate about your experience with drawing the scene.
Oh, yes. Okay. So Fury actually drew that scene. That was her debut scene into the book. However, it was fascinating, like in that early stage of the book when she was coming on board, and after I had completed my introductory scene, I was pretty hands-on as far as seeing where her artwork was coming from pencils and where the script was going to fit in. And a lot of this was in real time. Uh, she was figuring out how my own kind of black and white ink washes worked and how that was going to adapt well into her style so that we can kind of make this hybrid style together. Um, Her approach to this blew my mind because I had seen a lot of her sample pages at this point, but looking at the script, being a very visual, a visual reader and a visual thinker, I can't help but to read any kind of prose and kind of see visually how it would play out. So it really blew my mind that right out of the gate, Fury was laying out pages that were working almost precisely the way I already saw them in my head. And I was like, this is almost too good to be believed. Like there's kind of some kind of sorcery at play here. And so we just really clicked as artists working together. And I really didn't have to give very many notes or anything. She almost immediately rose to the challenge and really just had such a strong skill set. So yeah, a lot of it was to me, this scene was so heavy hitting that I really didn't have any notes. Her ability to actually, keep the camera still and allow panels to repeat themselves allows us to sort of increase tension, and her ability to pull back and sort of get rid of other details and just fall into light and shadow and silence. It was precisely the kind of classy drama that's necessary, particularly when you're using comics to convey a scene like this that has real human consequences, that's brutal and ugly and nasty. I discovered when I was drawing March and Run, I discovered very quickly that, like I grew up reading superhero comics of the 70s and 80s. That's my language. And so as a cartoonist, I'm very comfortable with visual depictions of physical violence as a superhero comics reader. However, when we started doing March Book One, I realized very quickly that I had to find that balance so that I was able to use the visual language of comics to convey some of the action and energy of violence, but without exploiting that violence because it's real violence that is acted upon real human beings, many of which are still here with us today. So she just, yeah, Fury amazed me with her ability to immediately get that balancing act. And I was like, well, we're firing on all cylinders, full steam ahead, let's go.
Um, Andrew, I just wanted to call back into when you mentioned how you were reading Julian Bond's work on the Vietnam War. And I noticed that in Run, you highlight, well, like the both of you, you highlight parallels between the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, and particularly how Black men were disproportionately drafted to fight for justice abroad while also being denied justice at home. And so I guess for the both of you, or specifically Nate, how did you approach illustrating this connection?
Um, let's see. Do you want to take this one first, Andrew?
It's up to you, man.
Okay. Well, I'd say this is where, particularly as the Vietnam War heats up and becomes more broadly controversial within the American public, particularly amongst young people who, like, until 1972, I believe, the voting age was 21. So you could be drafted as a teenager and have have no political voice through your vote to oppose the draft, but you could still be forced to fight and die. And I think that the parallels there between the draft, between forced military service into an active war by teenagers, 25% of the infantry forces being Black Americans, in the highest danger, occupation within the Vietnam War, uh, the connections were unavoidable there. For me, I think we only touched on it a little bit in March Book 3 as the Vietnam War was escalating throughout 64 and into 65. But I grew up in a career military family, and grew up as kind of like a GI Joe kid in the Reagan era. And a lot of my experience as, being a part of a military family had to do with a lot of conversations with my dad about his relationship to military service, his decision to join the military as a poor kid from Mississippi who needed to get out of his town and couldn't afford to go to college unless he went to a military academy. But this was at the same time that the Vietnam War was escalating. And so he chose to go to the Air Force Academy because he was making a risky decision, but he was trying to minimize his chances of being killed in action while managing to get a good college education and escape his circumstances in Mississippi. And so for me growing up, these were conversations that I had at a pretty young age with my dad, and they helped me learn to ask questions when other people maybe weren't asking questions. They helped me to remain curious and be able to balance things that don't have a simple one-way answer. And I don't know, a lot of that really shaped the way that I saw the world, uh, as an adult and as an adolescent. So, in general, I always try to keep that kind of ambiguity in my work. And, because readers are observant, curious people. there, we pick up on a lot of stuff, particularly with comics. There's a lot of information that is not textual information. The visual information is still information. And a lot of it is keeping enough space for readers to notice things and ask their own questions and really let the text do its work to kind of nudge and fully inform people. But yes, there was a personal side to presenting the parallels between the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, I think, for me, and the way my worldview was shaped as a kid.
But I mean, the Vietnam War was such a fundamental paradigm shift, both for the American um, culture, right? Because we for the first time, really, um, the anti-war movement moved to the forefront of um, the American protests movement, right? I mean, there was an anti-war movement in the 40s during World War II. Bayard Rustin was a part of it. In fact, went to jail for being a conscientious objector. But it was not front and center in the American psyche, right? The zeitgeist. But with the war in Vietnam, both, I mean, like lots of reasons, right? Like there's the fact that the Gulf of Tonkin incident is still widely questioned, the reality of what happened, right? So did we go in on false pretenses? Um, the fact that the draft um, targeted young black men at a time when young black men were participating in widespread protests, is that a way of depleting those numbers? Um, the fact that we spent so much money on this at the same time as American inner cities were begging for social programs. And, I mean, there are certain confluences of events that in some ways create great advances, but also um, break the fundamental social contract. Like I remember growing up, my mother talking about um, why so many more women in her generation did not marry, and that she believed it was because so many men died in Vietnam, and that there became a gender imbalance in her generation. Um, but for me to look at it through the lens of somebody who at that time was working on Capitol Hill, um, and had studied this as a political event, the war in Vietnam directly spurred, as Nate referenced, the passage of the 26th Amendment, which gave 18 to 20-year-olds the right to vote. Um, and also, it should be worth noting that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee was a older gentleman from New York who opposed it for years. And then when it was passed, he was ousted in a primary by a 30-year-old former SNCC staffer. So and this is, a New York member, so there's historical parallels there. Um, But also, like, you got to remember, like, the 26th Amendment, and this is where, like, history sort of rhymes rather than repeats. The first call for the 26th Amendment was Eisenhower's inaugural address. He called it Old Enough to Fight, Old Enough to Vote. And this idea that he had seen millions of young men be sent off to war to fight and die and never have the opportunity to choose the elected leaders who made that decision. And then ultimately for the passage of the 26th Amendment, and I wrote a whole comic book about it. It's called Register. You can get it from New York City Public Schools or read it online, or it's available for sale. The reason they actually ultimately passed the 26th Amendment and Nixon acquiesced and signed it into law, or to then be ratified, was because he was trying to appease the anti-war movement. He thought that by granting 18 to 20-year-olds the right to vote, the people who were in large part leading the anti-war protests, right, who had in some ways been inspired by or learned from the tools and tactics of the civil rights movement from 60 to 65, start taking up those tactics and then applying them on college campuses. And then, we get into this larger piece that we didn't cover and run.
the passage then of the 26th Amendment becomes a way of mollifying this group in the hopes that by giving them the right to vote, they will participate but then drop off. And ultimately Nixon's cynicism in pursuing that was correct. In fact, I think I don't believe we have surpassed the voter turnout of that first election after passage of the 26th Amendment since among young voters, among 18 to 20-year-olds. And I think all of this is so fundamental to understanding what's happening today. Because every part of this is, I mean, like, you remember a while back we actually talked about lowering the voting age to 16? You don't hear much about that right now. But that's it, right? Like, self-determination for young people of their elected officials. They will be more impacted by the decisions of the elected officials today than anyone else alive, and yet at the time they could not participate, and today they choose not to participate in large numbers, right? Congressman used to have this saying. He would say, talking about the right to vote, he would say, if it wasn't important, why are so many people trying to take it away? And I think we have missed the understanding in some ways that learning about Vietnam and the anti-war movement is so important to know, which is that, like, eventually they gave us the fundamental right, but then they engaged, the opponents of this engaged in two sides of challenging it. One is to sort of try and culturally make it uncool or like bog you down in so much stuff that it's hard. And then the flip side of that is make all those little pieces harder to execute, right? You can't vote with a student ID, but you can vote with a gun license. You can't vote with your library card, but you can vote with a passport, which is expensive, right? I mean, these various things where they just move the window a little bit. And young people in particular are much more sensitive to the cost. They're much more sensitive to their time being spent on these things. You have to understand the ups and the downs in order to understand why things are the way they are. And few events in American history, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, had more of an impact on the social and political dynamics of the United States than the Vietnam War.
That was a really great response.
Thank you
Speaking
for coming to my
on
TED Talk. No.
speaking on like young people in general and their role in their government, what is one piece of advice or like I guess a couple of sentences that you would tell a young person to either like get them involved in the government or get them to advocate or like push them to do something that they believe in? Like, what would you say to them or like to the young audience that's listening, perhaps?
I think first and foremost, I would say that your elected officials are more afraid of you than you are of them. And you have to use that. You get inside the bubble, right? Like you get on the hill, and I always joke there was no gravity on Capitol Hill because it was the center of the universe. So which way is up or which way is down? You get in there and you realize that so many of these people fall into, broadly two or three camps, right? There are some really intelligent people who worked super hard to get there. And then there's some really not clever people who got there because of who their parents were or their money they had or being in the right place at the right time. And then there's some other people who, mean well, but never had the opportunity to learn how to do it particularly well. And for me, I was very fortunate, right? I spent almost my entire congressional career following one step behind John Lewis, whether it was on stage and Nate and I going and talking and meeting kids and signing books and shaking hands. And, it's funny, they were talking about his arrest in 2016 the other day when he got arrested protesting for immigration reform. And people were like, do you remember that? And I was like, yeah, I loaned him his bail money. It's like, you're getting to see it up close, right? And I think you've seen former President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama comment on this, which is like, these people are not smarter than you. They are not. Most of these people are there by fortune, good luck, circumstance, birth. They are not there because they are smarter than you. And if you take away that veneer of superiority or whatever authority the title confers on them, the office confers on them, and you look at it from a tactical perspective, and you look at what they have in terms of resources, what they have in terms of institutional advantages, and you look at what you have, which is youth, energy, creativity, cleverness, you have the upper hand. There's a reason that the civil rights movement was so dangerous to the status quo. There's a reason that the CIA had to investigate. There's a reason that the FBI had to investigate and in many ways sabotage, right? Because young people who are well organized, disciplined, orderly, and informed and using creative tactics, they can change anything. But you have to realize what power you have. And you also have to realize that because of your youth, because of the fact that the world will be so deeply shaped by what you like, what you don't like, what you believe, you have the ability to see the future. So the example I always mention is I was 25 years old when I first mentioned to John Lewis that he should write a comic book, an idea that was completely preposterous at the time. But I had grown up in comics. Nate and I had grown up in comics. We knew their potential. We understood, even if we didn't explicitly know it, we were growing up on the internet. I mean, we're the last generation to have dial-up. We're the last generation to remember what it is like before the internet, right? So we lived on that cusp. And I think in many ways that allowed us to appreciate comics more because the language of the internet was becoming sequential narrative, words and pictures working together. And so we could see that future. And so I didn't know any better at 25 to say, Congressman, I think, people don't know your story. You've got these challenges. You should write a comic book. And I think for those of us who are no longer so young, we need to be much more conscious of the power of those ideas of young people, because I was fortunate that it was John Lewis I was saying this to, somebody who had spent almost his whole life listening to young people and was once one of those young people pushing for ideas that older folks thought were too radical. And at that time, the people around him did not think he should be doing a comic book. They would say it was not dignified. And the congressman didn't listen. He disregarded that, right? But because I was young, because I saw that, and because I stuck to my guns, and because I didn't believe in the fact that these people, just because they had a higher title than me, were any smarter than me or saw the world better than I did, I was able to convince him and help him and work with him and get him there to do something remarkable. And that's it, right? What is your march? What is your project? What is it that you're going to do that no one else could do that really will change the world? Whether it's the first graphic novel to win the National Book Award, or the fact that John Lewis leading a children's march at Comic-Con, then goes on to inspire members of Congress to lead a sit-in on the House floor, right? What is it that your ideas can create that then have ripple effects through the entire country and change the direction of where we're going as a culture and as a nation? So that's a little more than a few sentences, but
Thank you. That was a great speech, though.
So, in relation to what you were just saying, Andrew, I wanted to ask both you and Nate. I noticed that the story had a comic layout, and that seems to be an intentional choice, especially with the dark and dull colors. So, I was wondering, why did you guys choose to portray the story this way, and how does this grab the reader's attention?
Well, in terms of the general aesthetic of us telling John Lewis's story and the story of the movement, there are a lot of reasons that all combined, which resulted in Run and the March trilogy looking the way they look. Number one, in the world of graphic novels, especially like independent, kind of like indie graphic novels, a lot of stuff is done in color, but traditionally speaking, black and white is still kind of the gold standard. And it was just a natural kind of thing to tilt towards. We quickly realized we had our work cut out for us in terms of having to research and fact check things, but also deal with developing news, new information as we're writing and drawing the books. And that became a bigger part of our process. So frankly, while early on in the March trilogy, I had already decided it's gonna be fun to do it in these gray washes. But I was like, wow, had I done this as a color book, I don't necessarily think it would have added anything to the storytelling, but it would have taken twice as long to do. So we kind of lucked out in that small way where we wouldn't have been able to release these books on the kind of pace that we did for the first three books for the March trilogy. And that kind of momentum actually impacted the trilogy's relationship to protest movements throughout the United States and activating a social and political conscience, being a part of that throughout the states. The third reason is simply because for all of us who are born after the 1960s, our relationship to the 20th century American experience is in black and white. It's because of black and white video footage and photography. And originally, that was a question that I had to ask myself. I'm like, do I really want to lean into that black and white delivery of the past? Is that kind of cliche? Am I doing the wrong thing here? But then I realized, wait a minute, my brain works that way too. Like I was trying to really growing up in the South with, white baby boomer parents who grew up as kids and teenagers through the end of Jim Crow segregation, through the civil rights movement, I did get kind of a basic working knowledge of the civil rights movement and of segregation in the American South. But I feel like I realized my parents were putting a little too much effort in trying to make it seem like it was a very distant past. When the older I get, I'm like, whoa, they're telling me stories about stuff that was just like 15 years, 12 years before I was born. And that's nothing. The older I get, like 15 years is nothing. So I was like, you know what? If I relate to these historical moments in black and white, if I see them that way in my head because of the work of civil rights photographers and journalists who are covering it in the streets, why don't I use that to our advantage? And in my opinion, it worked. It allowed all of us to kind of automatically file what we were reading and experiencing within the pages of Run and March, be like, oh, this lines up with that photo I've seen, with this video footage, with the way that I've learned to absorb the history of the civil rights movement. So yeah, initially I kind of bristled at that idea, but then that's one of those moments where I had to second guess myself and realize, wait a minute, that's an advantage. I need to pivot towards that, not away from it.
That's very interesting. I also would like to ask both Nate and Andrew. So, in modern day society, teens may feel discouraged by the lack of social awareness and reform. What message do you hope John Lewis's story in Run communicates to teens who are watching this?
I think one of the most fundamental things that Congressman Lewis was trying to convey was the fact that, I mean, because Run is a pretty sad book. There's a lot of just frustration, uh, a lot of disillusionment, feelings of self-doubt, feelings of betrayal, feeling lost. And I think that was important for John Lewis to convey the fact that despite being a part of this massive movement and achieving real change in real time through the civil rights movement, at the same time, he was experiencing a lot of those darker feelings, a lot of that doubt, a lot of that isolation, asking the questions, is this worth it? And having his own friends and allies killed uh, along the way in real time. This is like a major psychic struggle for anyone to be involved with social change and to run not only that risk, but recognize that it's guided by human connection. And so to lose people, whether to have friends and allies be killed or to lose people's friendship along the way, that takes its toll. And to me, that's the tone that sets Run apart from the March trilogy, is it does show a shift in John Lewis's life that leads him to that next phase of his life, the phase of public service. But in order to get to a point where he realizes what that next stage in his life is, he really has to slog through some of the more negative elements of self-doubt and frustration and setback. We don't want to hide those things. Like, as we know, all of us concerned about the direction of our society, concerned about maintaining our rights as citizens and as people. We're terrified and frustrated by that sense that we are losing ground, or that all this work might have been for nothing. And so for Congressman Lewis, it was very important to show, I know what you're going through. I've been through this multiple times myself, and it's a part of the process. It's a part of the struggle. So to all of us, that had a lot of value. And that's really the value of storytelling, is there's room to fit all of these elements into covering his experience in the movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it right, Nate. I mean, Run is about what happens after you succeed, right? My friends used to tease me after March. March is my first books. Like, who does that, right? You're the dog who caught the car. And I think in some ways, John Lewis had the same feeling on a much grander scale, where you're 26 years old, 25 years old, you're a national name. You have been invited to the White House. You have been given a pen by the president for a bill that is signed into law directly in response to your baiting. Right? I mean, on this epic scale, few of us can ever imagine, right? And then within months, you're kind of forgotten, right? I mean, Julian starts to become the celebrity when before he was hardly known, right? And he's supportive. He's there for his friend. He's doing everything he can. He's sitting in the House gallery while they vote on the proceedings to expel him. He's there every step of the way to support him. And at the same time, within SNCC, his tactics, the devotion to nonviolence, his devotion to Dr. King, everything that got him to that place of national recognition, of achieving these major reforms for the United States, for his country, for his community, for his people, are then being rejected by his peers. He's seen as lame, uncool, square, as they would have said back then, which maybe we bring that one back, right? Like, how do you deal with that? And I think in our own way, both John Lewis and I were dealing with that after March, and wanting to explore that in Run, because here it's also this hallmark of John Lewis that gets overlooked. I think it's certainly been overlooked in the recent biographies that I've read, and yet is so fundamental to actually understanding who he is, right? Like, I think sometimes we get a little obsessed, particularly biographers, with recounting the dates and the times and what they ate for breakfast, and they miss the forest for the trees. Right? And the thing that they miss about John Lewis is that he reinvented himself over and over and over again. Right? It is so easy to stay the same persons, to keep doing the same things. It doesn't mean you abandon your ideology or your morality, but you have to take a different path to achieve results. History shows us that change is always happening. So whether it is John Lewis, the boy preacher, which was the vehicle he was taught as a child for how to impact your community, that he then gives up while he's at American Baptist Theological Seminary to become this activist who outrages his parents because he's getting arrested all the time and they're afraid of retribution, to then that no longer being cool. So then he becomes a political staffer, going on to serve on RFK's presidential campaign in 1968. And then literally his mentor and his boss are shot within 60 days of each other, shot and killed So then you've got to reinvent yourself again. And so then he goes into becoming he works in nonprofits. He starts working in community building through the Field Foundation and others. And then that transition into public service, right? And as we talked about at the outset, try and say as much as you can with as few words as possible, right? First you march, then you run. It's the building, it's the transition, but then you have to do something different. And then look at it in the long scale, right? I mean, John Lewis we celebrate today is not the John Lewis that I started working for and answering his mail in 2007. Back then, people didn't know who he was. He was sort of treated like a relic, much like he was during the movement. But then he hears this weird nerdy kid on his staff start talking about, hey, this internet thing's going to be big. Hey, what do you think about comics? Right? Like all these things that, the stuffed shirts working in Congress who were there to just be there. They didn't know, they didn't embrace. This is about the power of youth. But John Lewis always had his ear to the ground because he had reinvented himself so many times up to that point. And so here he hears an idea that makes sense to him. Why not? Try it. Reinvent yourself again. Do something unorthodox. Use history as your guide, just as he used Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story and Dr. King's use of that comic to inspire the earliest acts of civil disobedience. So he reinvents himself again. And then he embraces it and he loves it. He's cosplaying at Comic-Con. He's touring the country. He's following the Reverend Lawson's model from 1957 and 58, essentially of the Reconciliation Tour, going and giving talks in schools and libraries and wherever it will have him. Even though he's a sitting congressman, I remember us speaking in the basement of the New York Avenue Baptist Church to a room of 15 people. Because that's how hard we worked to get this story in front of people, to get those early days behind us so that people could see the importance of this work when it was published by a publisher with 4 people, including a warehouse guy. And what wasn't paid for by them was paid for by my student loan debt, right? Here he is, a congressman in his 70s, and we're still scraping by, doing this in the most, let's just say, grassroots way possible, with the generosity of people who embrace this idea and the force of will that true conviction requires. And he does that reinvention right up until he dies. He doesn't stop working. He works on this book. Cold. We're hiding. I mean, this is the height of COVID. Everybody's afraid COVID's going to kill him. So we're like hiding stuff in the shrubbery around his house so that people don't steal the manuscript that we're working on as we pass it back and forth. It never stops. You can never stop. You always have to be reinventing yourself because that is what he was so good at. It wasn't just the persistence. And when they tell you otherwise, when they say he's all about love, it's like, no, do not listen to those people. John Lewis loved everyone, but as Dr. King said, he also believed you had to love the hell out of them. And that's what we're talking about. Constant change, constant reinvention. That's what he did, and that's what made him so remarkable.
Yes, I think that's really amazing. And I really love how you guys were able to reflect that in your book because as teens, we really see what's going on in society. And some people are afraid to accept change. But I really like how you guys showed the importance of really like allowing change to happen in your lives.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's why I live in the woods now. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I mean, that's it, right? Like, we go through all of this and I get to see every part of the country, every Marriott hotel room you could ever want to, which they all look the same. But then you realize that like America is a beautiful place. Go outside, go see the trees, find peace for yourself. There's a reason Walden went to a pond, right? And John Lewis used to talk about this too. He would say sometimes he felt like there are these people who love the world, but they don't love people. And I think that's another thing that if I'm going to encourage you to do anything, it is that I hope you see the world. You get to know people. Get outside your comfort zone. Love people. Because that's also what John Lewis was about.
Thank you to the both of you, Andrew and Nate, for really telling us like all about the book. We can see your dedication and how hard the both of you worked to fight to bring this book to everyone, all of the young people who have read it, everyone who has received a copy. And so our event wraps up with your book being available to New York Public Library card holders who want to read it for free without waiting. And so if you're watching this online, you still have one more week to get it for free. And so can both of you or one of you talk about what that means in a time when a lot of books are being banned and access is restricted?
I guess I would just say, in a nutshell, that people are curious. Young people in particular can handle stuff that causes questions, that causes a little bit of doubt, that stokes your curiosity. Young people are always going to ask questions. Young people are always going to notice things. The real issue is whether or not adults are going to try to shut down young people for being curious, for having questions, for caring. Young people are never going to stop being curious and having questions. So to me, it's like it's a false controversy based around protecting kids from dangerous ideas, when in fact, this is the world we occupy. It's a matter of adults recognizing that it's their responsibility to be listening when young people do have questions. And young people can handle things that make them a little uncomfortable, that present truth in a way that's not too basic, too simple, too misleading. The role of adults in our society is to interact with young people and be ready to hear those questions, to be ready to follow those curiosities. So follow your curiosities. That, in my opinion, that's what society is partially here for, is to help prop each other up so that we have the freedom to pursue what we're passionate about, to learn, to grow, to change, and to be better at participating in society.
Yeah.
I actually have to bounce to pick up my kid from school. My apologies. But I want to say thank you for having me very much, and I'll hand it over to Andrew here. Great to see you, Andrew.
Thanks, buddy. It's good to see you. We'll talk soon.
Count on it. Bye.
I
All
think
right.
on
So what
that,
do you guys want to ask me now?
I think I think on that note, we're gonna wrap up the conversation today. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you so much, Andrew and Nate, who's already left. Thank you, Abigail and Praise, for such incredible questions. We really appreciated all of the honesty and all of the insight provided. For those who joined, please stay tuned for future titles in our Freedom to Read initiative, and have a great day.